Delaney? She took her clothes, her passport, and left. What about the children?
But the money wasn't the only thing she took. She copied the engineering designs I had spent years developing and handed them to another man.
Delaney? Let me speak to her. She doesn't want to speak to you. She's done with you, Marcus. Let it go. Delaney.
And then the line went dead. She was convinced I would fall apart, that I would never survive raising 4 children alone. 10 years later, she walked into that event hall, and everything she believed about me turned out to be devastatingly wrong. What did she see that stopped her cold? Stay with me, because this story is going to take you somewhere you don't expect. And if this is the kind of story that stays with you, consider subscribing. I'll be here every week with something worth your time. I have replayed that night so many times in my head that the details no longer feel like memories. They feel like scars. The drive home from my late shift, the way the porch light flickered when I pulled into the driveway, the strange stillness of a house that should have had the television on. Delaney always kept the television on when she was home alone. That was the first thing I noticed. Not the empty driveway, not the unlocked front door, just the silence pressing against the windows from the inside. Her side of the closet was the second thing. Cleaned out so precisely it looked intentional, which of course it was. Not a rushed grab in the middle of an argument, but a careful, premeditated removal of everything she had decided still belonged to her. Her clothes, her good jewelry, the small fireproof box where she kept her passport and social security card. What remained on her side of the closet was a single wire hanger swinging slightly as if she had only just left the room. I went to the kitchen because I didn't know where else to go. On the counter was her old cell phone, the one she had replaced 3 months earlier, sitting face up next to a glass of water she hadn't finished. The text message arrived at 11:47, exactly as scheduled. I can't keep doing this. The bills, the kids, the dreams that never go anywhere. You were always the one taking care of them anyway. They'll be better off with you. 4 sentences. No mention of where she was going or who she was with, though I already suspected the answer to both. I checked the bank account from my phone while still standing in the kitchen in my work jacket, still holding my keys. The emergency fund, $11,600 we had built over 3 years for exactly the kind of disaster I was now standing inside, had been withdrawn in full that afternoon. 2 separate transactions timed 2 hours apart, almost certainly to avoid triggering a bank alert. She had thought of everything. What I didn't find until later that night when I sat down at my computer unable to sleep was that the folder containing my FlexArc design files had been accessed and copied. FlexArc was 3 years of my life, compressed into blueprints and material specifications and late-night calculations done at the kitchen table after the kids were in bed. I had started building it after our daughter Eliza spent 8 months in physical therapy, learning to walk without losing her balance. Watching a 5-year-old fight that hard, to do something most people never think twice about, changes the way you see everything. I wanted to build something that could grow alongside a child, something a family wouldn't have to replace every few months because their kid had outgrown it. I had been refining those designs for years, and now they were gone, copied off my hard drive by the woman who used to bring me coffee while I worked on them. When I called the number Delaney had listed as her new contact, a man answered on the second ring. I recognized the voice immediately. Bryce Holloman, a medical device distributor who had hired Delaney repeatedly over the past 2 years to organize his trade conferences. I had met him exactly once at a company dinner where he shook my hand too firmly and asked what I did for work in the tone of someone who had already decided the answer wasn't interesting. "She's done, Marcus," he said. "Let it go." Then the line went dead. I stood in that kitchen for a long time after. Not crying, not yet angry, just absorbing the shape of what had happened. Delaney hadn't left because she was unhappy. She had left because she had already arranged something better, and she had used everything she could take from me to help fund the transition. The kids slept through the whole night, all four of them undisturbed in their rooms upstairs. Caleb in his corner bed, surrounded by the small mechanical things he was always taking apart and reassembling. Jonah sprawled across his mattress with his arms out wide like he was trying to hold the whole room. Maisie with her nightlight on, and a notebook on her pillow because she sometimes woke in the middle of the night to write things down before she forgot them. And Eliza, the smallest of the four, curled under two blankets the way she did every night, even in warm weather, sleeping with the kind of total certainty that only children have, certain that everything would be the same in the morning as it was when they closed their eyes. I sat in the hallway outside their rooms until the light changed. I didn't know how to explain what had happened. I barely understood it myself. It was Eliza who asked first, the way she always did, directly without softening the question. She came downstairs in her pajamas, looked around the kitchen and said, "Why isn't Mom making breakfast?" I told her Mom had to leave early for work. Eliza looked at me with the expression she had been making since she was 2 years old, the one that said she wasn't entirely convinced but was willing to let it go for now. She climbed into her chair and waited for me to make the eggs. By that afternoon, Delaney's mother had arrived. Darlene Whitaker was a woman who moved through difficult situations by immediately reorganizing them into something she could manage. She showed up with her younger sister Rochelle, a casserole dish, and a plan she had clearly already worked out during the drive over. She didn't ask me how I was doing. She sat down at my kitchen table, folded her hands, and told me that the most practical solution, given that I worked full-time and had 4 children all the same age, was to divide the kids among different family members while I got back on my feet. Rochelle could take 2. A cousin in Nashville had already offered to help. It would only be temporary, Darlene said, using the word the way people do when they don't entirely believe it themselves. I understood that she meant well, but what she was describing was a situation where my children who had already lost their mother in a single night would also lose each other. Caleb in one house, Jonah in another, Maisie and Eliza separated from both of them, growing up in a cousin's home in a city none of them had ever been to. They were 5 years old. They had never spent a single night apart. I told Darlene no. She pressed harder than I expected, walking through the practical problems one by one: the mortgage, the childcare costs, the hours I worked, the legal dispute already forming on the horizon. Bryce had already contacted my employer claiming that my FlexArc designs incorporated proprietary data belonging to one of his distribution partners and demanding I cease all development immediately. My manager had called me that morning, uncomfortable and apologetic, asking me to come in for a meeting the following week. I knew what that meeting would be. So yes, Darlene was right about the numbers. The situation was close to impossible. A single income, 4 children, a stolen design, a lawsuit forming, and an emergency fund that no longer existed. Every practical argument she made was accurate. But that evening, after she and Rochelle had gone home without the answer they came for, I walked upstairs and found all 4 of my kids asleep together on the floor of Caleb's room. They had pulled the mattress off his bed and dragged their own blankets in and made a kind of nest in the middle of the floor. Jonah had his arm around Eliza. Maisie was pressed against Caleb's back. They hadn't done this because I told them to. They had done it because, in the logic of a 5-year-old, being close to each other felt safer than being alone. I stood in the doorway and understood that there was really only one decision I was ever going to make. I was not going to let anyone separate them. Not Darlene, not the circumstances, not the weight of everything about to come down on me. Whatever it cost, however hard the next months were going to be, these 4 kids were going to stay together in the same house, under the same roof, with the same father putting breakfast on the table every single morning. The next day I called a lawyer. I had almost no money to pay him, but I explained the situation and he agreed to work with a reduced upfront fee. I locked every remaining file on my computer, changed all my passwords, and began documenting everything I could about the history of the FlexArc project, every sketch, every dated email, every therapy receipt from Eliza's physical therapy sessions that had originally inspired the design. I built a paper trail the same way I built everything else methodically, one piece at a time, because the alternative was to have nothing at all. I stopped waiting for Delaney to call with an explanation. I stopped running through conversations in my head where she came back with a reason that made sense. The scheduled text, the empty closet, Bryce's voice on the phone, that was all the explanation she had chosen to give, and I decided to accept it and move forward. Because the 4 kids sleeping on that mattress upstairs needed a father who was looking ahead, not standing in a kitchen at midnight staring at a wire hanger. I was 34 years old. I had $11 in my personal checking account. And I had 4 children who were going to wake up in the morning and need breakfast. So that is what I made. The meeting with my manager lasted 11 minutes. I know because I watched the clock on the wall behind his head the entire time he was talking. Bryce had contacted the company's legal department claiming that FlexArc incorporated proprietary data belonging to one of their distribution partners and that I had developed it using company resources on company time. My manager said he was sorry. He said the company couldn't afford to be pulled into a dispute of this nature. He slid a termination letter across the desk with the careful expression of a man who has rehearsed this conversation and is relieved to finally be done with it. I drove home, made lunch for 4 kids just getting back from school, and didn't say a word about what had happened. That evening, I took on my first repair job, a neighbor's riding mower in the garage after the kids went to bed. Within 2 weeks, I had added a morning delivery route that started at 5 a.m., and a second repair client who needed a commercial refrigeration unit fixed by the weekend. I ran on somewhere between 2 and 3 hours of sleep a night, and told myself this was temporary, that I just needed to hold the ground until the legal situation cleared. The electric bill fell behind. The bank sent a letter about the mortgage that I put face down on the counter and didn't pick up again for 3 days. The kids figured out I wasn't eating properly before I admitted it to myself. I kept telling them I'd eaten at work, and for a while they accepted that. Then one evening, a few months after Delaney had left, Jonah came into the kitchen while I was calculating bills at the table and set a box of crackers and a jar of peanut butter down in front of me without saying anything. He pulled out the chair beside me and sat down close enough that his shoulder was against my arm while I finished what I was working on. He was still 5 years old, and he didn't offer a solution or ask a question. He just stayed there. I didn't cry in front of him, but it was close. The emails turned up on a Tuesday afternoon in February. Caleb had been using Delaney's old tablet for a school project. It was the only device with a large enough screen, and he wandered into the kitchen holding it at arm's length like it had burned him. He said, "Dad, I think you need to see this." The tablet was still logged into Delaney's cloud storage account, which she had never signed out of and apparently never thought to close. Inside were months of correspondence between her and Bryce, detailed, deliberate, covering everything from my work schedule to the specific clauses in my employment contract that could be used against me. She had sent him the FlexArc files not the week she left, but 8 months earlier. She had been building this with him while we were still having dinner together every night, while she was still helping Eliza with her stretching exercises before bed. One email in particular was difficult to read. Delaney had written that I would never sustain a legal fight while raising 4 children alone, that the pressure alone would be enough to make me walk away from the design. She had framed it as a strategy, a timeline, a prediction she seemed completely confident about. While Caleb had found the emails, it was Maisie who thought to look more carefully through the account. She had always been that way, quiet, thorough, attentive to things other people skimmed past. She found a folder of automatically synced audio files, recordings from the old phone's built-in call recorder that had been backing up to the cloud for years without Delaney ever managing them. Maisie didn't listen to all of them, but she listened to enough of one recording to understand what it was, and she copied it to her own device with the careful instinct of someone who had learned early that important things disappear if you don't hold on to them deliberately. I forwarded the emails to my lawyer that same night. He called back within the hour, and for the first time since this had all started, his voice carried something that sounded like actual optimism. The emails established clearly that Bryce had received the FlexArc files from Delaney, not from my former employer, not from any legitimate business arrangement which directly contradicted the claim his legal team had been constructing. It didn't get me my job back, and it didn't repair the damage already done to my reputation in the industry. But it gave us something real to work with. Without a conventional employer willing to take a chance on me, I rented the cheapest workspace I could find, a corner of an old converted carriage house in the distillery district, shared with a man who repaired motorcycles and asked no questions about my hours. I worked on FlexArc there every night, after the kids were in bed, driving over at 9 and returning before 5 in the morning so I could make breakfast. The design was getting better. I had more time to think now, which was the one advantage of having nothing else to lose. Audrey Fenwick came into our lives through Eliza's school. She was a pediatric physical therapist contracted through the district's support program assigned to run Eliza's annual mobility assessment. I met her in the hallway outside the gym after the evaluation, expecting a 5-minute summary. Instead, she asked me what I did for work. When I described the FlexArc project, she asked to see the current designs, not out of politeness, but the way someone asks when they've just recognized a problem they've been thinking about for a long time. Her observation was precise. Children in long-term physical therapy often outgrew their equipment every 4 to 6 months, and most families couldn't keep pace with replacement costs. A device that could expand progressively with a child's growth would remove one of the biggest barriers to consistent treatment. That was exactly what FlexArc was built to do, and hearing her name the problem so clearly made me realize I had been building the right thing all along, just building it in isolation. Audrey started coming to the carriage house on weekends to go through the designs. She knew things about pediatric anatomy and therapeutic load distribution that I didn't, and she pushed back on my assumptions in ways that made everything better. She helped reduce the device's total weight by nearly 30%, and redesigned the expansion joints so adjustments could be made without tools. She also knew a community clinic on the east side that had been running therapy sessions without proper mobility equipment for 2 years due to budget cuts, and she asked if I wanted to run a trial there. The first attempt failed. A connection point in the lower assembly gave out under load before a young boy named Tyler, who hadn't stood unassisted since a car accident 14 months earlier, could get any real use from it. The second attempt failed in the same general area. I went back to the carriage house that night and rebuilt the joint from scratch using different materials and a different angle of attachment. On the third attempt, on a Thursday morning with Audrey beside me and Tyler's mother sitting against the wall with her hands pressed together in her lap, Tyler stood up, took 3 steps forward, turned around and walked back to his mother and put his arms around her waist. I sat down on the clinic floor and looked at the ceiling for a long time. Not because I had proven something to Bryce or to anyone else, but because a child had just done something everyone had been telling his family might not be possible, and it had worked because of something I built in a rented corner of a carriage house while my kids were asleep. I registered Kinforge Mobility 2 weeks later. Audrey became the company's first clinical advisor. The founding principle was straightforward: no child should have to stop treatment because the equipment no longer fit or the family couldn't afford to replace it. Around that same time, Audrey had started appearing more regularly in the daily rhythm of our house, helping with homework, driving Eliza to appointments when I couldn't leave the workshop, showing up with food on the nights I was working late. The kids had accepted her presence in the careful, observant way children do, testing its edges without fully committing. One afternoon, Eliza asked her point blank whether she was my girlfriend. Audrey didn't answer immediately. She opened Eliza's math book and said, "I'm someone who wants to help your dad finish something important. The rest of it, let's let time sort that out." I was standing on the other side of the kitchen door when she said it, and I understood that this woman was not trying to push her way into a space she hadn't been invited into. She was simply being present and letting us decide what that meant. What I didn't know at the time was that she had received a senior clinical position offer from a facility in Boston, a role she had been working toward for years. She didn't tell me immediately. For 2 weeks, she carried it quietly, weighing what staying would cost against what leaving would mean. The night she finally decided to bring it up, Eliza spiked a high fever and called for Audrey before she called for me. Audrey sat beside her bed the entire night, checking her temperature and talking to her until she fell back asleep. The following morning, she called Boston and declined. She told me about it a week later, matter-of-factly the way she reported things she had already fully resolved. I told her I didn't want her staying if she was only staying because there was no better option. She looked at me and said, "I had a better option, Marcus. I chose this one." When Kinforge's first real purchase order came in from a regional therapy network, Bryce filed for a patent injunction within the week. He submitted the copies Delaney had given him as evidence that the FlexArc concept had originated within his company's research division. Then Delaney signed a sworn affidavit stating that I had only begun serious development of the product after attending a medical device conference where Bryce's team had presented similar ideas. Every word of that statement was a lie she had watched me disprove in our own home for 3 years. She had been in the room when I built the first rough model for Eliza. She had driven Eliza to the therapy sessions that shaped every major design decision. She knew exactly where that design had come from. She signed the paper anyway. The injunction froze production, locked our business accounts, and sent 8 of our employees home without pay. The bank moved forward with foreclosure proceedings on the Meadowthorpe house. I had no choice but to move the kids into the rooms above the Kinforge workshop, small, drafty, smelling faintly of machine oil, nothing like the home they had grown up in. The last night in Meadowthorpe, I walked through each room, taking down frames and packing what I could. Behind the tall cabinet in the hallway were the pencil marks we had made on the wall every few months since the kids were 2, their heights recorded in a vertical column, each one labeled with a name and a date in my handwriting. I couldn't take the wall with me. I stood there looking at it, and for the first time since all of this had started, I thought seriously about accepting Bryce's settlement offer. He had proposed dropping the lawsuit in exchange for full control of FlexArc and a one-time payment that would cover the mortgage and give me enough to restart somewhere quiet. I could protect the kids financially. I could end the fight. Maisie found me at the kitchen table with the settlement papers in front of me. She didn't say anything about them directly. She got a pencil from the drawer, tore a page from her notebook, and called the others in. One by one, they measured each other against the doorframe, laughing about who had grown the most, arguing about whether Jonah was standing on his toes. I stood watching them from the doorway, and it became very clear that what was worth holding on to was not recorded in that wall. It was standing right in front of me. Then Caleb looked over at the settlement papers and asked the question that settled everything for me. He said, "If you sign the dad, what happens to the kids still waiting for the device? Not what happens to us. Not what happens to you. What happens to them?" I pushed the papers to the edge of the table. We went into the final hearing with almost nothing in reserve. But Eliza's therapy records, the dated design files recovered from my original system, and the emails Delaney had never thought to delete were enough. The judge ruled in our favor. Bryce's claim was dismissed and the patent remained with Kinforge Mobility. Bryce sold his company shortly afterward and left Kentucky, and Delaney, who had tied her future to his, found herself with neither the man nor the outcome she had gambled everything on. I walked out of the courthouse into a gray November afternoon with almost no money, no house, and a company only just barely still standing. But the work was ours, and we were still together, which, if I'm being honest, was the only outcome I had been fighting for from the beginning. 10 years is long enough to rebuild almost anything. It is also long enough to understand exactly what you lost, what you chose to build in its place, and to know, without any remaining doubt, which one matters more. Kinforge Mobility no longer operated out of a rented corner of a carriage house. We had a manufacturing facility on the east side of Lexington, a clinical partnership network covering 43 states, and a waiting list for our adaptive equipment that ran 3 months long on a good quarter. I still went to the production floor most mornings before the administrative day started. Still sat down with parents in the evaluation rooms when my schedule allowed, because that had always been the part of the work that reminded me why we were doing it. Watching a child stand up in something we had built was something I had never been able to delegate. Caleb, Jonah, Maisie, and Eliza were 15. They had grown up in the workshop then, in a proper house again once Kinforge had stabilized, and they carried the particular self-possession of kids who had watched their father lose everything and build it back without bitterness. They weren't hardened children. If anything, they were unusually careful with people, attentive in the way that comes from learning early, that presence is not guaranteed, that the people who stay are the ones worth paying attention to. Audrey and I had been married for 7 years. She had never asked the kids to call her anything specific, had never pushed toward a title or a designation, had simply continued to show up the way she always had, steadily, without making a performance of it. Whatever the kids decided to call her, she said was their decision to make in their own time. The Halcyon Pediatric Mobility Center had been in planning for 2 years. It was a non-profit rehabilitation facility the first Kinforge had built and funded entirely outside our commercial operation, designed to provide equipment and therapy free of charge to families who fell through the gaps in the insurance system. We were holding the opening ceremony on a Saturday in October, which meant all 4 kids were available, which meant we were arriving together. I had learned through my lawyer about 6 weeks before the ceremony that Delaney had contacted a family law firm inquiring about whether she retained any financial claim connected to Kinforge. Our divorce proceedings had been slow and complicated in the early years. She had never engaged with the process while she was with Bryce, and finalizing everything without her participation had taken longer than it should have. By the time everything was legally settled, Kinforge already existed. Apparently, someone had suggested to her there might be an argument worth making. My lawyer resolved the inquiry quickly and told me it had been dropped. He also mentioned almost as an aside that she had purchased a ticket to the Halcyon opening ceremony, which was listed publicly as a charity event. He thought I should know. I didn't tell the kids. There was no reason to walk them into that morning already carrying that weight. The event hall was full by the time we arrived. Donors, clinical partners, families who had gone through the Kinforge program, a few local officials who had supported the zoning and permits. Caleb was wearing a suit jacket that he and I had taken in together at the shoulders the previous weekend, working side by side at the kitchen table with a needle and thread, because he wanted to learn, and I was glad for the excuse to teach him. Jonah had spotted a young boy in a manual wheelchair near the entrance and had immediately gone to hold the door and fallen into easy conversation with the kid's father. Maisie was carrying a flat archival box containing the original FlexArc sketches, the very first rough drawings dated and annotated in my handwriting from the years Eliza was in therapy, because she had suggested we display them near the entrance hall, and I had agreed without hesitation. Eliza was holding the ceremonial scissors for the ribbon cutting, turning them over in her hands the way she handled everything, feeling the weight of the object before committing to it. Audrey was beside me. She had been beside me for so long now that I had stopped noticing the specific fact of it, the way you stop noticing reliable things until something shifts the light and you see them clearly again. I saw Delaney before she saw us. She was standing near the far wall in a gray coat holding a program from the event watching the entrance with the expression of someone who has rehearsed something and is waiting for the right moment. She was 50 yards away and I recognized her immediately, the posture, the way she held her chin slightly elevated in rooms where she felt uncertain. A habit I had once found endearing and now simply registered as familiar. Then she looked toward the door and saw us walking in. I watched her face move through several things in quick succession. Recognition, then something more complicated. A calculation colliding with a reality that didn't match what she had prepared for. She had seen the Kinforge name in newspaper profiles, had seen the industry coverage. But reading about something and standing 40 feet away from the physical evidence of it are entirely different experiences. The 4 teenagers beside me were not the 5-year-olds she had left sleeping upstairs. They were composed, present, visibly comfortable in this room and with each other, and with the woman walking beside their father, who had her hand lightly on Eliza's shoulder and was leaning in to say something that made Eliza smile. Behind us, covering the entire rear wall of the entrance hall, were 10 framed photographs, one for each year since Kinforge's founding, chosen by the kids themselves. In the earliest photographs, I was alone with 4 small children, the backgrounds modest and worn around the edges. Audrey appeared for the first time in the 4th photograph at the far edge of the frame. She had only just come into our lives in that period present, but not yet centered in it. By the 6th photograph, she was noticeably closer to the middle. In the most recent one, taken 3 months ago at Caleb's school awards night, she was standing in the center with all 4 kids arranged around her, Jonah's arm across her shoulders, Eliza's head tipped toward hers. Delaney stood in front of that wall for a long time. She approached us during the reception before the ribbon cutting. She walked directly toward me and then seemed to recalibrate when she got close enough to see the kids' faces, to see that they were not looking at her with the confusion or longing of children who had spent years missing their mother. They were looking at her with the careful assessing attention of people who had already formed their own understanding of the story. She said she knew she had made a terrible mistake. She said she had been young and overwhelmed that Bryce had offered her something she hadn't had the wisdom to see through. She said she had been living with the weight of that choice for 10 years and had come here because she wanted the chance to begin making things right. She said all of this in a measured, prepared way, and I didn't hold that against her. What you say when you finally show up matters less than the fact that you waited 10 years to say it. I didn't answer for the kids. I stepped back slightly and said that the 4 people standing beside me were 15 years old and entirely capable of deciding for themselves what kind of relationship, if any, they wanted with the woman who had given birth to them. Caleb spoke first. He asked her not aggressively, but with a precision that left no room for deflection whether she knew how many birthdays she had missed. Not 10, he said. 40. Because there were 4 of them. Jonah asked why she had only come back after Marcus's name started appearing in the newspaper. Delaney began to answer, started to say something about not knowing how to reach out, about shame, about timing, and that was when Maisie took out her phone. She had carried that audio file for 10 years, copied from Delaney's own cloud account the winter after she left, transferred forward through every device Maisie had owned since. She told Delaney she wanted her to hear something, and she pressed play. Delaney's own voice came through the speaker. The recording was from a phone call made not long after she left Delaney, telling Bryce that the kids were only 5 years old, that in a few years they wouldn't remember having a mother, that Marcus would be too overwhelmed to tell them the real story anyway. She had said it casually, the way you say something you've already decided is settled. The recording lasted less than 2 minutes. When it ended, the expression on Delaney's face was the expression of someone who has run out of alternative explanations. She had come prepared to talk about being young and overwhelmed and led astray. But that recording was her voice, her words, and they described not a woman who had collapsed under pressure, but a woman who had made a deliberate calculation and was comfortable with it. Eliza was the last to speak. She said quietly and without heat that Delaney had been right about one thing: they had learned to live without her. They had learned it because they had no choice, and because their father had made sure they weren't learning it alone. She said they hadn't forgotten what happened. She said they probably never would. And she said that whatever came next, if anything came next, was not going to be decided in an event hall at a ceremony Delaney had bought a ticket to after calling a lawyer about financial rights. Delaney turned to Audrey then, and her voice carried a harder edge when she said that Audrey had taken something that didn't belong to her. Audrey didn't raise her voice. She said simply that no one can take a place that has been left vacant for 10 years, that a space abandoned long enough stops belonging to the person who left it. I spoke to Delaney one last time. I told her that if she genuinely wanted to rebuild something with her children, not to resolve guilt, not because Kinforge had become newsworthy, but because she actually wanted to show up for them, then she would need to start by acknowledging fully what she had done, withdrawing every financial claim against the company and agreeing to family counseling under terms the kids set themselves. She could not walk back into their lives as a mother on the basis of a single afternoon. She would have to earn that the way everything worth having has to be earned slowly, repeatedly, without a guaranteed outcome. She didn't respond. She looked at the 4 of them one more time, and whatever she had expected to find in their faces, she didn't find it. They weren't waiting for her. They had somewhere to be, people to stand beside, and a ribbon to cut in 20 minutes, and the ceremony was going to proceed whether she was in the room or not. We left her standing near the entrance wall and went to take our places at the front of the hall. The ribbon cutting went the way those things go. Applause photographs, a short speech I had written, and then mostly set aside in favor of saying something closer to what I actually meant, which was that this building existed because a lot of people had refused to stop when stopping would have been completely understandable. Eliza cut the ribbon. The crowd applauded. Jonah was already back in conversation with the boy in the wheelchair before the formal portion had fully ended. We skipped the donor reception. Instead, all 6 of us drove to the Copper Skillet Family Grill, a diner near the university, where I had taken the kids the night we won the patent case, the night I had about $14 in my wallet, and told them to order whatever they wanted. We took the long table by the window, the same one as before. Maisie waited until the food arrived. Then she reached into her bag and brought out a flat piece of finished wood about 8 inches long mounted on a small backing. I recognized it before she said a word. It was a section cut from the door frame at Meadowthorpe, the exact strip of wood that had held all 4 of their pencil mark heights. She said she had arranged to have it cut and preserved before the house was sold and had been waiting for the right moment to bring it out. It was going on the wall at Halcyon, she said, near the entrance, so that the families coming through there could see it. Not as a monument to what we had lost, but as evidence that growth is what happens when you keep showing up even in the years when everything is hard. I held that piece of wood and didn't trust myself to say much. Toward the end of the meal, in the middle of a completely ordinary conversation, Caleb asking about more coffee, Jonah describing something that had happened at school. Eliza reached across the table toward the breadbasket and said without looking up, "Mom, can you pass that?" Audrey was the closest one to it. She picked it up and handed it over, and Eliza took it and kept talking, and the whole exchange was so unremarkable that it was almost finished before any of us registered what had just happened. The table went quiet for one beat, just one, everyone noticing the same thing at the same moment. Audrey didn't make a speech about it. She reached over and put her hand on top of Eliza's for a second, and I saw in her face, just briefly, the expression of a woman remembering a night she had sat beside a sick child until morning and understood for the first time exactly where she belonged. Then the conversation picked back up as naturally as if nothing had shifted. But something had shifted. Something that had been true for a long time had finally been said out loud in the most ordinary possible way by the smallest and most direct of my 4 children. I looked around that table at the 5 people sitting with me in a diner booth at the end of an October Saturday and understood something I had been circling for years without quite landing on it. The thing I was most proud of had nothing to do with the patent, the company, or the building we had opened that afternoon. It was this, that 4 kids who had every reason to grow up guarded had instead grown up generous, that they knew how to sit around a table and make room for each other. That somewhere in the years of difficulty and rebuilding, they had learned that the people worth keeping are the ones who stay. Delaney had left a space in our lives, and she had been right that we would learn to live without her. What she had been wrong about, completely irreversibly wrong about, was what that space would become. She thought it would stay empty. She thought her absence was the same as erasure. But we had filled it. All of us together over 10 years of ordinary mornings and difficult evenings and small decisions made in the right direction. We had filled it with something she could see, but could no longer touch, because the door she had walked out of a decade ago didn't open from the outside anymore. It opened from the inside, and we were the ones who decided who came in. If this story stayed with you, if you found something in Marcus and those 4 kids in the quiet way Audrey chose to remain, I'd love for you to be here for the next one. Subscribe if you haven't already. Every week I bring you a story about the kind of strength that doesn't announce itself, the kind that just keeps showing up. That's the only kind that really lasts. Family isn't always the people who were there at the beginning. Sometimes it's the people who refuse to leave during the hardest parts of the middle. Hold on to those people. And if you're in the middle of your own hard chapter right now, keep building. The door opens from the inside.